So, just to let everybody know, we this is another episode of Twitter Spaces presented by Industrial Logic. Uh, we gather here every Friday at 2 p.m. Central to discuss blogs written by our very own coaches at Industrial Logic. And today's blog is written by Tim, and the topic of the blog is story points. Why is this so hard? Uh, we're gonna go into detailed discussion on the topic. Before we do that, I would like everybody, welcome everybody in the space. I would like everybody to share this space so that we can have more and more people joining and have
Yeah,
more
get your followers in
interactions.
here. All
Yeah.
you people.
Yeah.
You've got followers.
So with that, I would go ahead and let Tim talk a little bit about his blog post and a little bit around the origins of the story points, and how you basically started using it. And meanwhile, I would encourage everybody in the space, if they want to, add some comments, give some feedback, add questions, feel free to request the mic. And anybody in the panel from IL, you guys are also welcome to pitch in. So feel free to speak your mind when you want to. So with that, I'll hand it over to Tim. Go ahead.
Hey, Mandeep, is there a post inviting people that I can really quick just repost, re-click, retweet?
Yes, so basically what you can do is at the bottom right corner of this space, you will see an icon which is basically a comment icon, and once you click on that, you'll see the post. You can, like it, you can reshare it. I can also put it in the top of this space, so it's easier for you guys to fetch it.
Okay,
Or you
I was
guys,
able to do that. Thank you. It's very helpful.
Huh.
yes.
That was unintuitive, but okay.
Yes, so once you
Nice.
have added, somebody shares it, you can see that it has turned to like a purple icon. I don't know if everybody can see that, but once you click on that, you'll just be able to share the space with everybody and as your followers are.
Good, good. Well, welcome everybody. Good to see you. People are still joining in, it looks like. That's nice. And welcome to our space. So, story points, they're such an odd thing. They were a little thing that we did back in extreme programming. Um, and they were somewhat helpful sometimes, but they weren't the end all be all. And the people who invented them, that would be Chet and Ron, have since apologized for coming up with story points. But I think it was well intended. It was not a bad idea. It kind of deals with the idea that a lot of people think that programmers know how long the work is going to take. They just won't tell us, which is, patently wrong. There's
I
absolutely
knew
no
it.
way.
I knew it. They're holding out on us.
That's right. And they always know exactly what to type. They're just really reluctant to do it. As opposed to being, people who learn on the fly and discover and it's too hard to know, right? So originally they wanted to get some estimates, and they said, how long would this take? And they said, well, it's hard to say, and it depends on how busy we are, and if there's a problem rises, and if things don't work out. Well, I tell you what, if it was an ideal day, and we could for sure focus really well, and everybody was available, and things went pretty much as planned. An ideal day, probably somewhere around 10. And so they had 10 ideal days, and they came up with something else. How many ideal days would that be? Well, this would be 3. And they said, okay, then 13 days from now, it'll all be done. And the team said, no, 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 no. No, that won't happen. Oh, yeah, you said 13 days. That's the estimate. 13 days, it'll be done. No, we didn't say 13 days. We said if we had 13 perfect, ideal days, then it might be done by the end of the 13 days. We didn't say that we're going to be done in 13 days. Well, you said 13 days. That's what we've got, 13 days. And then 13 days later, the managers were very unhappy. They had expectations and had made promises based on 13 actual days of work. So the teams were like, this is terrible. What are we going to do with this? We can't tell people it's going to be 13 days. If it's not going to be 13 days, they get mad at us. And they came up with the idea of, like, forget days. Just don't worry about days. We're going to do some relative sizing, and it'll give us a band to work on, and who knows how long. But okay, this thing that we did, the last 3 things we did that were like this kind of took about 3 days each. So we'll do comparative. How does this one compare to those? This is a little smaller. Okay, we'll call it 3 days. Still, they missed. But they didn't miss as horribly. So now they're thinking, okay, and everybody who studies estimation tells you, measure what you've done before, and if you're doing a similar effort, then assume a similar time, and that will help. So I kept trying to do that, but with days, it just kept going wonky. And then somebody told them, working in real time is hard for people, but working in relative sizes is better. So if this one, we call it a 2. If it seems half as bad, we'll call it a 1. If it seems twice as bad, we'll call it a 6. And they said, oh, we'll try that. And, it was less horrible than the other way and still terribly imprecise. But it's less horrible than before. So you take the less horrible and you run with it. Well, this also had problems, but, we just call it 3. What's it a 3 of? I don't know. Days, hours? No. What's a 3? It's 3 times as big as a 1. How big is a 1? Kind of smallish. How long does it take to do a 3? I don't know. So this is very unsatisfactory, right? So they go back again and they say, well, okay, let's measure our actual times and compare them to these numbers. And they find out, usually if it says a 1, it's somewhere between a half day and 2 or 3 days usually. But it depends. I mean, it could be an hour, but it could be a week. But usually somewhere like a day and a half to 3 days. Well, that's the band of a 1. Okay, what's a 2 like? Well, is it twice as long? Well, it turns out no. A 2 might only take a half day, but it might take a week and a half. Why? Well, it's bigger. Well, why does it ever come up shorter? Well, because sometimes it's not as hard as it sounds, or we get lucky. I don't know. It happens. Well, what's a 5 like? Well, a 5 usually takes 3 days to 12 days when we actually measure. Well, what does that mean? Well, can't you give us a more precise measurement? We want to know exactly when it's going to be done. And story points never did that. They just never worked. And to this day, people are using story points, and they've assumed that there's a linear relationship, that a 5 takes 5 times as long as a 1. And that linear relationship has never existed and does not exist. So I think it's probably a good entree, an opening. What do you all think? Do you have any statements, questions?
Well, maybe we can solve it by instead of using these weird Fibonacci things, we can just make it like have arbitrary numbers like 2.5 fractions.
That's right. If you put decimals, that'll
or
fix it.
T-shirt sizes, that could work.
What if we used animals?
Yeah,
Fibonacci was
giraffes.
smart, by the way. I think that Fibonacci and powers of 2 were pretty good adaptations, right? So you have a 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. The idea is that each time when the number gets bigger, the number doesn't just get bigger. It's not like 1 day plus or minus 1, 2 days plus or minus 1, 3 days plus or minus 1, 4 days plus or minus 1. That's not how it works. It's not linear like that. So using the Fibonacci shows that, it increases, the range increases a lot more as you go up. The difference between a 5 and an 8 is bigger than the difference between a 1 and a 2. So it shows that there's more spread, less confidence less accuracy with the bigger stories, which I think is at least helpful. If you're doing story points, then powers of 2 and Fibonacci are not the worst way to do that.
So one of the things that I found confused and hard to explain to people in the initial part of my career when we were using story points is what context to use in terms of thinking about that piece of work. Is it effort? Is it time? Is it more complexity? Uh, so what it was very confusing for people to understand the context in which to think about the piece they were trying to estimate.
Yeah, and there are people out there teaching story points. They're saying, "Oh, do not estimate effort, estimate complexity." And other people are saying, "Don't estimate complexity, estimate effort." And other people are saying, "No, don't do those two things. Instead of effort and complexity, um, try to calculate the number of items involved or the number of ways it can go wrong." And everybody has their pet theory about it. Um, the truth, I think, is more upsetting than that. A story point is about muchness. It's how much it is.
Much what?
Well, muchness,
Yes.
right? So you might have a story that is really straightforward, but it's going to be a lot of typing. And that might get you a 1 or a 2. Or it might be that you're not sure how to do it. You're going to have to study the code base more. And then it turns out to be hardly any typing at all. But that's going to get you a 1 or a 2 also, right? You might need to dig into the specs and talk to the customers more. And so much, maybe that gets you a 2. Or maybe you don't really know your stack that well. There's something between the Python running fast API and the React on the front end and the communication between them both. And there's some weird plugins and things that we're using. We're just not sure how it'll work. It's really straightforward, we think, but that's probably going to earn us a 2 because we're going to have to learn more to do it. And then there's the really straightforward. However, it's in that ugly file that we're all afraid of. And that means there's about a million ways that it could cause us to inject a bug that we couldn't possibly have predicted. So even though it's a little thing, maybe that's a 2 or a 3.
Or maybe it's probably going to be straightforward on our side, but it crosses a boundary where it's handled by that other team. And wow, they're just not good at estimating.
Yeah. Or maybe our programming is really easy and straightforward, but they're going to have to test this under about 5,000 different situations because there's all of the flags and configurations and things they have to deal with. So the work that we do is like, not even a 1, but the work the testing group in our team is going to do is going to be weeks. Maybe it's a 12. It's a 20.
So there are much, dimensions of muchness?
Yeah, there's a lot of much. I like to break it down to a couple of really simple ones. I think that you could, if you're feeling like being reductionist, which I often do, you could break it down to uncertainty. So you're not sure what to do, how to do it, what will happen, effort, which is just raw typing, raw reading, right? Raw testing. And then there's risk, the chances that it's going to break something you're going to have to fix in order to finish it, right? Those 3 are pretty good if you think about muchness. It's all about the uncertainty and effort and risk, and every story will have different degrees of each of those things mixed into it. But if you could come up with just those 3 things and you come up with a number, you get a 5. It still won't be done in the same amount of time as another 5. So, it's like all of this work and it's not even any better. Well, right. Have you seen that where, pretty much uncertainty, effort, risk doesn't actually come up to the same calendar interval?
Right. Yeah, Tim, and I think you're starting to touch on, I think, one of the things that's kind of that story points tend to fail in the same way or get misused in the same ways over and over again. It's because 2 numbers are the same people start comparing them within a team and even across teams, and all of that leads to is the path, right? The path to the dark side.
I kind of wish that we didn't use numbers. I wish we'd use letters, because a number does sound linear and it sounds like things you can directly compare. When I compare a B to a D, I don't intuitively have the same relationship comparing a 2 to a 4.
Didn't you say animals before? I
Animals,
think
yeah.
animals might be like even stronger.
Yeah,
So
this sprint we're going to turn in
this
2
is
ferrets, a cat, and a grizzly
I got
bear.
capybara. It's this one's easy.
Yeah, we have 2 guinea pigs, but the other one's a kiwi, so it's going to take a long time.
Oh my gosh, this is a freaking emu. Like, watch out.
Yeah, we've got a polar bear coming up, so we're not going to get anything else done. Otters can either, I think that one of the things it misses too is it's not the number, it's the range.
Okay, I think
Oh,
we just lost Tim. So Tim, you'll have to join again.
maybe he lost it's my neighborhood power outage affecting him.
Yeah. Um, so meanwhile, I would like to request everybody in the space to please share the space. There's a purple button at the top bottom corner, right corner of the screen. Just click on that and share the space. We have a few other coaches in the panel as well. We have Fazaro. Would you like to add something to the discussion, what we have discussed so far? I see other people in the space as well. I would love to hear from the audience as well. So please feel free to request for the mic and come on the speaker panel and have your say around the topic. That would be great.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add other than my experience with this has just been so frustrating, trying to get people to think in terms of probability when all they want is a certain answer. And, whatever method we use to get there doesn't seem to address that core conflict. Story points or otherwise.
So I see I also see Joshua. You have joined the space. Thank you so much for joining and welcome.
Hey, everyone.
So I think I saw one of your posts on LinkedIn yesterday, Joshua, around story points. Would you like to take a moment to elaborate a little bit on that?
Absolutely. I'm a huge fan of story points, and I think everyone should be using them.
Oh, soundbite.
No, I just want to say, for those who are here that don't know me or us, Industrial Logic, we used story points for a good 7+ years. We used them to calculate velocity for our own projects. We taught customers what a story point is. We worked with our customers to try to get us a consistent velocity from iteration or sprint, to iteration or sprint. And it all just seemed to make sense until we started to see some cracks that the closer we looked at it, the more we started to see problems, and we tried to fix the problems and found that led to more issues. So probably over 10 years ago, I wrote a blog called Stop Using Story Points, which documented all of our findings. It's rather long, but well worth your read if you're interested. And we ultimately abandoned them. And I think a sign of a healthy, agile, mind is to be improving your process. The manifesto itself says, we are uncovering better ways of working. We found by dropping story points and dropping even sprints, we found a cadence that worked even better for us, and that also seemed to have worked well for our clients. So it's not that you've dropped all the discussions around how big something would be. We do something called bargain hunting. So if we're given, some problem to solve, well, there's many ways to solve it. We'll brainstorm a variety of ways and then pick the one that is the best fit. Sometimes you can do 80% of what's being asked for in a short amount of time instead of 100% of what's being asked for to take a much longer time. Sometimes that's viable. So bargain hunting is a chance to figure out what would be the biggest value for the least buck, for the least amount of money. But story points, yeah, vanished, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I don't want to keep talking because you all need to talk here too, but happy to answer any questions about our journey away from story points and why we find them to not be very, very helpful anymore.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. I think in my experience as well, one of the things that I experienced is they used to vary from team to team, right? Every team had their own kind of way of pointing the stories, and there will be situations where we would see where there would be comparisons between different teams. Okay, this team has this much velocity, and the other team has this velocity, and it used to vary a lot, and there used to be comparisons, which I thought was not a good idea to compare one team's velocity with another's.
Yeah, that other team needs to like pick it up because wow, their velocity is so much less than ours.
Yeah, we dealt with this a lot, and so we started to say, look, that team does kiwis, and this other team does limes, and we try to come up with different names of fruit to refer to the story points as fruit, and that
Oh, that's
it's not.
funny. Right
Yeah,
before
you
you joined, we were talking about like what if we used animals instead of numbers?
well,
So
so
fruit.
you can't compare apples to oranges is the old expression, right? So
Ah.
using fruit was an attempt to work with this. It did not work. It didn't make a damn bit of difference. Like I said, we tried. We've tried a million different things to patch and improve and fix and try to make story points work. The bottom line is one of the students in our class, a class years ago, said, so a story point is a nut. And I was like, what do you mean? He said, well, it's a nebulous unit of time. And that kind of stuck, and we're like, yeah, mm-hmm. And that was one of the most advanced teams we've ever worked with. And they actually had a director who had taken our boot camp, understood what we were doing. At one point, the director said to them, we actually need to go faster. We need to get more done, more done in each iteration. Well, their velocity, which was consistently in the 50s or maybe close to 60, shot up to like 80 or 90 in the space of like a few days. And I came back, visited the team, said, what happened? How did the velocity go from like 57 consistently around that 57 mark up to like 80 or 90? And this woman said to me, oh, Josh, well, these days, if you sneeze, you get a story point. And it was the beginning of us starting to really reckon with ourselves and say, this is really kind of a weird vanity metric that's not that helpful.
Yeah, I guess this is John Kern speaking. My personal experience is to care only about delivering stories, features, whatever you want to call them, value. And I could give a crap about story points. I can tell you I've abused the field story points in Jira just to say it's a 1, 2, or a 3, just kind of alerting the team what I think the level of complexity is. And threes would never make it. They never get on the stack because we always would break them down. So for me, instead of caring about all that effort, whatever it is that you use to come up with some story point value, instead spend it breaking the damn thing down, turning it into smaller features, and then what you'll find is you get to a cadence of, hey, we do about 10 features a week. That's good enough, because mostly people just are interested in what you can deliver. And so I think story points are a really dumb idea, and trying to make them numerically accurate is even stupider. I shouldn't say that, but I mean, it gives you an illusion that you can actually be mathematically accurate, and it's just, don't even bother. It's kind of my attitude.
Makes a lot of sense, John.
Nice name, John.
I know, it's easier to say.
Oh, break it
we,
down.
we drop a letter.
We have
I think
three
it's
people here who are JON.
All
yeah,
right.
I think it's good to be cautious about any kind of frameworks that are kind of pushing more into story points or looking to compare them. I know one of my favorite topics is SAFe, and they work to normalize story points across teams. And in doing so, their recommendation is to make a point a half a day, which I think are some unit of time. And they say in their training so that anybody in the organization knows how long a story point is. So it's really like the exact opposite of what the intention of story points are. So
That's terrible.
yeah, so be cautious of that.
Yeah, that is like the you might as well just say hours. I remember being reprimanded, so to speak, by a GE, some vice president. I don't know, building software to help sell pumps and other really high technical products in a meeting, and the guy basically is trying to explain to me shortly after he said a story point means, and he equated it to hours, like 3.7 hours. I forget. He had an actual number. And then as the conversation went on, at some point he said, "Well, John, there are some agile classes that you could go to. You can probably look up." I didn't say who I was. I was there with another company, and I remember his second lieutenant, sort of like second in command. I'm at the coffee mess shortly after that. The guy's just like, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. My boss doesn't." Da, 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 da. I'm like, "Don't worry about it." I mean, but that's the level of stupidity that people have taken such things to. It's like, just call them hours then. Screw it. Go back to estimating with hours. If that's what you want, do it. Stop hiding behind some dopey phrase called story points.
I think that's fair. And of course, who knows, right? Because one of the problems we have is that even if our estimate was right, we don't know what's going to happen in the real world. We can't take into account things like, well, interruptions and deprioritizations and reschedules. It doesn't give the certainty we think it does.
Tim, welcome back. That kind of rides in on where you were right when we lost you, which was that you were saying that these are really bands. They're not like fixed points.
Mm-hmm. That's right. It's more like, if a story point was to relate to hours, then a story point would be more like dice. So you think about, one story point is a 6-sided dice of hours, half days, whatever. And then a 2 is like 2 dice. And 3 is like 3 dice. And a 4 is like 4 dice. And you see that it's not just the average that changes, it is the span, right? And that's really important. Maybe the bottom of that span changes a little, but the upper level of that span changes rather a lot. And the spread is there. Which, by the way, I keep finding teams using story points, and what they want to do is they'll finish a story earlier than they thought, and they'll say, "Oh, we should change the estimate on this. It was really more like a 2 than a 5." Like, dude, no, that's where the bottom of the range of a 5 is. You leave it as a 5 so you can recognize what the estimation range is. If you're going to use story points, then, don't adjust them post facto. You're trying to find out what the range is. And every estimate is a range with a confidence. And of course, the easier answer is, don't estimate.
Yeah, bingo. I got one along those lines, Tim. It may be even funnier, where a team, story, we couldn't get it done in a sprint, but they got 7 out of the, I don't know Fibonacci off the top of my head, but someone whoever plays the planning poker can figure out. But they would take credit for the partial work that they did, and then want to reduce the story points and put it into the next sprint. I'm like, oh my god, no. But yeah, it's similar. Like just stop it.
How does that even help with estimation if you
Yeah,
chop it into pieces and don't add them together?
exactly. It's like you're missing the whole point. You don't have any idea about like stochastic process control, or just stop it. But
Hey, John, since you're here, what did you think of my revisionist history of the story point?
when? Sorry,
Oh, I gave a little history of it before we started.
I didn't join at that
Oh,
point.
okay.
Yeah.
That's in the article. So if you get a chance to look, I'd like to hear your opinion.
Okay. I know Ron Jeffrey rused the day that he ever thought it up.
Yeah, I brought that up too.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that people kind of insist on it being a point value rather than a band. And like you said, it shows a real lack of understanding of estimates in general and stochastic control. Yeah.
And typically, what I've seen, even when like a band is given, it could be between this and that, is that whoever is running the project management side of things says, okay, so it could be in 5 days, and then they go out and promise it to the higher powers. 5 days.
Yeah, always take the lowest.
Yeah, that's a little bit like the old days of when I was doing a lot of project work and bid and proposal. They never ever seemed to pay attention to the range. They only picked the numbers that were most beneficial to them. Yeah, it's a classic.
I had a PM once tell me that, we gave him an estimate that something is going to be, about a week and a half, which by the way was based on prior work and, all the right things. And we gave him a range, and, the middle of that range is about a week and a half. So it's a 50-50 chance of being short versus long. So, pretty good number. And they went and promised it out for 3 days. And I asked why, and they said, well, because we know how this works. You guys always pad your estimates in order to get some space. It's like, why did you ask me for an estimate if all you're going to do is divide it by 3?
See, my boss used to always multiply it by 3 because I was lousy at estimating. So I have a feeling that's why I've developed a complete way to avoid estimating.
And I think that comes down to the fact that not only are they always wrong, but they're not that useful. The fact that it's, between 2 and 12 days is not all that handy.
All right, at this point, I see Kevin, you have also joined the speaker panel. Would you like to add a comment or ask a question? Please go ahead, Kevin.
Sure, thanks. So I guess I'm curious, what do we do instead, right? We break work down. We get an idea of how many features we can deliver in a week. Is What do we do to be able to answer that question of when are we going to be able to deliver something? When are things going to be done?
I can tell you how I do it, unless Tim wants to speak first.
Go right ahead.
All right. So what I like to say is I will estimate when it's necessary. And I give a little anecdote. For example, Grundfos, one of the world's largest pump manufacturers, liked what we were doing with some web app development, and wondered could we have ready for uh, this main pump show event in Florida the ability for them to have their specifying engineers sign up and like kind of become members and build a little bit of a community. So they had an idea about some functionality. And meanwhile, the show is in January 20th, something like that, and this might have been around the first week of December, right? So I'm like, oh, okay, that's a real question. Hang on, let sketch it out a little bit. I'll talk with the team, and I'll let you know if, because we got Christmas, right? You know what's going through my head. So talk to the team, figure out what it is that we needed to develop and deliver for the trade show, and back it off maybe a week for a little flexibility and troubleshooting, and decide we can say yes. So that's a real estimate with a real deadline. It's not a bullshit estimate that some rights that is, I think, most of the reasons people want estimate. That's a real deadline. So then what happens is we have, of course, a list of things, features we want to build, but we're working on the most critical. Like if this thing doesn't work at all, then it's a completely worthless, endeavor. And so we get really focused, push everything else aside, don't get distracted, make sure we make that deadline. So that's how I handle a real estimate. But as far as the general run of the mill, the team is just cranking. Um, the energy and effort goes into, instead of worrying about estimating story points, we worry about breaking down the stories, like using story maps, figuring out what can be deferred, only focusing on that we need to deliver right now, making things small, so that I'm flowing a lot of small things through the system, and the variation is greatly reduced, because we're not suddenly doing a 13 or a 21 point story and then a 1 and 1 and 1 and a 3, right? It's just everything's small, and we there's a lot more that goes into it, but that's the basic approach, that I stack up a bunch of small things on the list. And if there's 50 things on the list and we do 10 a week, anybody with a brain can figure out, if they ask, if I add one to the bottom of the list, when will it get done? Or we don't really care about the order. If you want to shove something in the middle, don't care. So that's how I do it, Kevin, is just focus on building small stuff of value and counting how many we do. That's complicated, and I found that to work.
I'd love to have something clever to add to that, but that's mostly, there is I guess. So John's talking about this, and it's, you're paying your staff, and you've got a monthly burn rate. All right. And then if you have been working on small things and counting, and you do, 12 of them a month or whatever, 17 a week, whatever your case is. You put something in today, what's your development lead time? It'll come out in 4 days or whatever. Then just understanding your team makes it a lot easier. But there's this other thing that I want to kind of ping on. When you're asking for software, are you buying a refrigerator or are you buying groceries? If I'm going to buy a refrigerator, I need to know what it costs, when it's going to be delivered, when I can expect it to be able to put stuff in it. I need to know the total cost and when it will arrive. That's, buying a refrigerator. I don't know what my total cost of groceries is going to be, because I only buy them when I need them. I buy them week by week. I pay for my electricity month by month, and my water comes month by month. So it comes to a different question. I mean, we're paying the people anyway. So how much of the monthly burn would you like to dedicate to getting this thing started? Well, we don't know what it's going to be worth. Okay, how much of your monthly burn would you like to dedicate to finding out if it's worth doing? Right? I mean, you're paying anyway. You're paying when they estimate. Why don't we pay to de-risk it, or to, make the first steps? Or, consider funding it like drip funding, because that might be the better way of working. What would you be willing to invest in this? And this is important because it's really not up to the programmers when something is done anyway. It's done when the product managers and the sponsors say, that's enough, don't do anymore. If that's helpful.
Yeah, that's a good point. Another thing I should add is what I care most about is we're working on the next most valuable thing. So that stack of 50 that I was talking about, and when I flippantly said, I don't, if you want to insert the next most important thing on something we haven't begun, don't care, right? I'm not invested in the list of 50. I'm only invested in what, like the top 5 that might have been pulled off the stack. So that's another key thing is, did we at least work on the right thing? That's really critical.
Yeah. Josh is here and he goes like straight out of his pocketbook on some of this stuff. I imagine Josh as a proponent of evolutionary design and someone who has to fund some initiatives probably could tell us a few things here that is useful too.
Well, thanks, Tim. Yeah. So basically, I look at all this through the lens of risk management. I think when John Kern was talking, he's definitely talking about evolutionary design, because what you're building, John, isn't components; it's working stuff, working software. Is that right?
Yeah, correct.
So it's always working. It's just under. It's not as sophisticated yet, and so the next question is, what's the next small thing we can do to make it more sophisticated? So you're working already from a different paradigm than a lot of other shops. A lot of other shops would be like, well, they're doing the front end, and they're over there, they're doing the back end, and then there's some middleware and there's some other stuff, and none of it's actually running. Everyone's doing burn down charts and sprints, try to figure out how much stuff they get done each sprint, but you got no working software. So right off the bat, you have a tremendous amount of risk because you really don't know if it's all going to come together, and there's a lot of nervousness, and then the project managers are going crazy trying to figure out if they're going to make anything happen. What we prefer to do is not be nervous, not be wondering if anything's going to work. What we do is let's integrate and collaborate early by standing something up and running, and then saying, great, what's the next most important thing, just as John said. And then you're evolving, and you can make decisions along the way to say, now I can release it, or nope, we need these next 5 more things, then we could release it. And by the way, of those 5 things, maybe we don't need them to be so fully featured. They don't need moon roofs and leather seats. They could be more basic versions to start, and then later we'll add more functionality. So there's all this decision making around evolving. But we can hit a date, no problem. And when we need to hit a date, let's say it's a hard deadline, like a conference appearance, great, work backwards from, if I've got 6 months to the conference, what does my solution look like the first 2 months? I want to focus on that. Can I make an awesome thing in 2 months that does pretty much, the core of what's needed by the conference date? And then great, next 2 months, what am I going to focus on to get it to be more sophisticated and more sophisticated? That tends to work just fine. And what we're doing along the way is, I would say we're sizing. When we look at some sort of next thing to build, we'll say, well, how big is it? Is that going to take a couple of weeks to work on? Maybe a day or two? Is it hours? And what is it? So having those conversations, I think, is fine to make decisions about how much sophistication is needed. But we'll often break that down into, it's the thin slicing people talk about, right? Thin slicing. So that's how we work, and it doesn't really involve any kind of story point estimates. Frankly, I think trying to figure out how much stuff you can fit into a sprint is a waste of time. If you'd asked me in the early 2000s, is it a waste of time? I said, no way, this is critical. Today, years and years later, no, it's not important. You need to focus on what you're building, do evolutionary design, thin slice, and bargain hunt, and you'll be on your way doing good risk management. But do not spend any time trying to figure out how much can we fit into a sprint. Waste of time.
Yeah, I acknowledge that. Okay, maybe we're starting a new team, a new product. I might do. I just said this last night to a book club. Said I'm. Yeah, we might do like a get into a cadence. Maybe do some 2 week sprints just to give you a little bit of breathing room and figure things out. But I said quickly we'd be abandoning that as a matter of course because we don't, might be training wheels, might be a little helpful to get started, but other than that, now it's why would you batch things up? Why would you incur a 2 week lag by design? Or 4 week, depending what your sprints are. So yeah, to your point, Josh, like I could care less about sprints. I remember I had a boss who said, "Hey, my brother-in-law is out in the Northwest, and he runs a cool software company, and they do monthly sprints. Can we do monthly sprints?" Yeah, sure thing, Trig. Because I could give a shit because it's completely meaningless. I run everything like a Kanban and just pretend like there's a sprint and didn't really care about it. So there's that.
Yeah, it's so easy to just say, look, we're sprinting. Look, we have a backlog. And a backlog is a bunch of items to work on. A sprint is, we're working every 2 weeks, every 4 weeks. Anyone can do that. There's no skill involved. Versus actual thin slicing, learning how to thin slice, that's like really important. And when my youngest daughter learned to ride her bike, we didn't use training wheels. Just said, hey, just treat it like a balance bike and just glide for a while and learn how to balance. And then once you feel like you're balancing, then you can just start pedaling. Never even used training wheels. Today I look at training wheels and say it's a perfect metaphor for an old-fashioned way of thinking. Today kids are learning on balance bikes where they learn the core of bicycling is balance. Fine, learn that first. Learn to balance. You can put your feet down anytime to stop yourself. Great safety there. Get that balance in place, and then you're going to be riding. And same in Agile, which is to me, learn thin slicing, working small, way more important than trying to fit stuff into a sprint or trying to, figure out your story points. Learn thin slicing, working small on valuable things with evolutionary design. You're going to be in way better shape. And we're doing that with beginners, by the way. We are not saying you got to start with sprints and you'll eventually get to Kanban. We're starting right off the bat with just, hey, let's just do one small thing at a time.
Oh man, you're just bringing back for me all the hours of my life spent in meetings, planning meetings, estimation meetings, where everyone and it's everyone, right? So it's not just like hours spent on me; it's hours spent on everybody all at once, arguing about is this a 3 or a 5?
There's a go ahead.
So naturally, like John, we're going to resolve that situation by asking the question, well, story points aren't working. We're sitting here arguing with each other and wasting time. How do we estimate better? And really the as Josh and John were talking about, like the problem is not one of, estimating better. The problem is the context that the estimating is being done in. Is that this, so it's not a matter of finding a better technique. It's like this heartbreaking thing of like you have to find a company that's working better or change, the infrastructure of the way your company is building software to make these more sensible ways of estimating even make sense. So what do we tell people who are on a team looking for a better way to estimate when really what they need is, transitioning to the paradigm of evolutionary design?
Well, I found that it's not very helpful to tell them to take their finger out.
You mean like hold it in the wind, that kind of, or
Of where it may be currently residing.
Yeah, I'm interpreting that like 9 different ways right now too.
yeah, there was a lot of ambiguity in there, but okay, I think you helped paint a sad picture. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, let me give you a better painting of the picture. We wrote a blog called Scatter Gather, explaining this dominant way that a lot of organizations are working in software, and they need to know exactly what it's going to be and exactly how long it's going to take and exactly what the design will be way up front, because the way they're going to do this work is they're going to take a design of the endpoint, what they're going to deliver. They're going to slice this into 1,000 pieces, well, maybe a few hundred, and then these pieces they're going to give to different people to work alone on, right? And if you didn't have the design to divide up, how are you going to get one person chunks cut out of it, right? So you're going to get this big design to take a hole punch and punch it into 1,000 different pieces, and each of these pieces are going to farm out to different people. And those people are going to be, they have their own queue of work. Maybe they'll get to this one first, maybe they'll get to it last. They're on different teams. Some of those teams may change priorities. This stuff may get pushed down further. It might be pushed to the front. It's hard to know. But this story, this design, this epic is going to be in 500 pieces scattered out across 40 people. And it's hard to know what the status is at any given point in time, because some pieces are done-ish but haven't been integrated. Some pieces haven't been started. Some pieces have been integrated somewhat, but they're buried behind something where nobody can see it. But eventually, we need to know when that last piece is done so that we can begin the hard work of reintegrating all of these pieces from all of these people, and then to try to make it work. And then, of course, we're going to have to do the debugging and fix all of the places where people misunderstood the original design and all of the unintended consequences where it breaks other features. And then we can get it out the door. And that scatter-gather way of working, where the work is split into pieces and spread out across people and regathered at the end, is just such a poor way of working. There's really nothing good to say about it, except it keeps everybody really busy.
Yeah, correct.
Well, if you have that situation, then you need to know the design. And you really need to have a good sense of the estimate, because it's going to be a long, dark time with nothing working. And you need to know how long that's going to be.
And
All
what
right,
if you
I'll take
didn't?
this moment, sorry, John, I'll take this moment to invite the audience to come up to the speaker panel and share their thoughts, ideas, questions on the topic. So please go ahead and try to request the mic, and we'll be sure to bring you on the speaker panel. Thank you. Go ahead, John.
I was just going to briefly say, what if we didn't work that way, right?
That sounds eminently reasonable. I'm not sure that's going to go over.
Yeah.
I would
Well,
have a long retort to that, Tim, but I think Muneeb is asking for other questions.
Go ahead. Meanwhile, we get somebody else on the speaker. We have an interesting comment from Thomas Peter. He's saying, I've consulted with many dozen companies over time, and only about a handful worked with story points in a way that wasn't pretty much just bound up on time estimation, organization requirements, forecasting milestones, and deliveries often trips up agile estimations in story points. So, I mean, it's pretty easy to kind of manipulate the story points in my experience as well. And I think this is a psychological safety issue as well, because, you know, within development teams, developers, they can manipulate the story points based on, if they are being pressured on delivery and that sort of stuff. They can always come up with, higher story points and, make it kind of load the story points and make it feel like they're doing as much as, it is required.
one thing you can do if you're using story points and you can't get out of that paradigm right now is basically, maybe this was said already, but endeavor to make every story point estimate a 1.
Yeah, I worked with a team that did that, and then the realization was, oh yeah, we're just counting at this point.
Yeah. And that's precisely the experience that Don Wells had. Don Wells was an early extreme programmer. I think he created extremeprogramming.org. He worked on the Chrysler project in the 90s, and Don, they got to the point of just counting stories, how many stories they historically got done per iteration, and then just kind of went for that each iteration, since they were doing iterations back then.
I had an interesting experience with that on 2 teams that I worked on that were really good and focused on thin slicing and did the, agile, like the XP practices. But we were in an environment where we had to estimate story points. We measured over a period of a few sprints and found that the number of stories that we got done were actually more accurate than the story points. And so we wanted to use that as a way to stop doing story pointing altogether.
Now, that was an adult thing to consider, right? Like, how many teams do you think ever stop to look at, hey, so I wonder what is a better predictor of our, success, so to speak? Is it simply number of stories, or is it story points and things like that? That was very impressive that the team actually stopped to question that.
All right. We have Saurabh who just joined the speaker panel. Welcome, Saurabh. Thank you for your joining, and go ahead and add your comments.
Hey, hi everyone. This is really nice to hear all of you. Uh, I only had like a question, sort of. Like the basic idea behind estimation was like doing the planning and identifying like what can be the potential timelines. So we do need like some kind of estimation, right? And like I work for a very small firm, and usually like we have to do a lot of estimation upfront during the sales cycle itself. And then because it's a small firm and we usually target these smaller projects, so we kind of do the planning as well, like what will be the milestones, and like how soon or like how long we can complete, like duration, what will be the duration of the project. So obviously story points, I mean, that's relative, everyone has a different definition and it doesn't work out very well. But still we have to do some kind of estimation, not during the development phase but in the sales cycle itself. So what will be your views, like how that should be done?
I can. Oh, go ahead, Josh.
No, go ahead, John.
I was going to say you know, that's a that is a definitely a different request. Like a lot, I'm going to say for my answers up until this point were about a team, salaried, just plowing through stuff. But you bring up a fascinating element that certainly was a long, large part of my adult working life, was doing bid and proposals and doing those sorts of estimates. And of course, sometimes it's based on things you've done before that are like that. But what I learned quickly on is I tended to work more with trying to develop a rapport with the client or the prospect to give them some ballparks, but then depending on how what the request to build was, to give to try to bring them into the fold and put a little skin in the game in terms of, if it's super complicated and it's super important, let's do some time and material work up front to get a better feeling for what you need, so that we're not just doing something based on an RFP and the written word is not accurate enough. So I could talk for quite a while on that subject in and of itself, but part of it is really educating the client that it does no one any good for us to pretend you know what you want and I know how to deliver it, unless it's something really trivial, and I've done it 10 times before. Then I can get pretty accurate, but that's the lesson of 10, 15 years of doing proposals, and that's what led to me doing agile stuff before agile stuff was invented.
Yeah, John, just to further your point, I think if I remember correctly, the Poppendike's first book, Lean Software Development, they talk about that you contract differently when you work this way. So you're not trying to just make up how long something's going to take, and that you actually contract with your clients differently when you work in this way.
Okay. I think educating the client, I think that's a kind of summary, and then building the repo on top of that. I think, yeah, that's how it should be. Thanks, John. Thanks for your comments.
There's a game we like to play, and that is, I need estimates to do planning. It's like, how would you plan if you didn't have estimates? What would you do instead? And a lot of times, that comes at an inconvenient time. So when there is a convenient time for it, if you were to think about drip funding, right, or that kind of a model, maybe something from beyond budgeting that you would look at, so that you would say, well, if we weren't going to estimate and plan based on estimates, we would probably, maybe, I don't know your organization, maybe we would plan based on value. And we would decide how much we would invest in capturing some kind of value. So maybe I want to have 30 million people using my social media app. Well, that's a great thing to want. We don't have estimates on how to make that happen, but how would you like to start? How would you de-risk? And I think that's one of the things Josh and John both brought up is, we're going to do this thing. We're not sure what the investment is. How would we de-risk it and get it to a point where we can work? And the other piece of that is the only thing we know for sure about time is that it will run out. And I wanted to bring up the idea that when time runs out, 100% of the work is only 80% done, we're screwed. There's nothing to do for it. We have failed. But if at the end of the deadline, 80% of the work is 100% done, we can probably go to market. That's a qualified success. So the idea of having things done early and often, fully done, running, working, is probably more important than knowing the actual end date when the full scope will be realized. Even if you knew that, you still want everything important done first and early, right?
Yeah, well said. Another thing that's often done in this context is you charge for small periods of time. So you'll say, great, here's what we charge every 2 weeks. And we'll demo to you what we've got every 2 weeks. If you want to continue funding us, great. If not, we can stop where we are. That is a technique I've used in the past when it's a fixed bid contract. We are just doing a fixed bid contract right now for a large client. It's a point of sale system. We so the way we approach that is we had someone who's written about 4 or 5 or 6 other point of sale systems in the past. They joined us in some meetings. We studied the existing point of sale system, which is an old 10-year-old piece of code that needs to be rewritten. And that expert, who's again done it many times, helped. We looked at it. He looked at it, and we gave them an estimate. We said, yeah, we can do this. When do they want it done? They wanted it done in about 9 months. We said, yeah, with this size team and with this collaboration from you, we think we can do it in 9 months. So that is kind of like a expert level estimate. And then, so then you're like, okay, was that complete nonsense? Is this really going to take 2 years? Well, the way we approach that is let's go after the high value, high risk stuff early and often. So all of our planning is around going after the biggest risky stuff right now, early on in the project, so that we have a sense for, are we on track or not, and luckily we are. So again, that's an expert weighing in, having done it many times, and then approaching it in this evolutionary design way, where you're going after high value, high risk from the early days. You're literally bringing up a point of sale system that runs, albeit very primitively, but it can do all of the point of sale major workflows. It's just got a lot of functionality that needs to be added over time. But a lot of that's easy stuff. If you attack the hard stuff first, it makes your estimate, come into line a little bit. You could always renegotiate. You could say, look, it turns out that the payment processing thing you want us to use, it sucks. And if we work with this, it's going to extend this by 6 months. So we need a better payment processing approach. That you're doing risk management with your customer. Then you're collaborating on that instead of it just being a lawsuit or something like that. So it's a combination. There's all kinds of ways to approach it, but you're right that in a context like that, you do need to give some kind of a number.
Yeah, that's
And
great.
I think it's also important to keep setting up the expectations with the client, something like evolutionary, estimation or whatever, but, keep them in confidence, keep getting in touch with them, work closely with them. As you said, Josh, collaborating with them is the best way to go.
Yeah, the FDD, which is called feature-driven development, was one of a few people that invented feature-driven development were at the signing of the manifesto. So John could probably talk about that. One of the people that was also there was Jim Highsmith, and he really loved the FDD parking lot diagram. And the parking lot diagram, it's not a great name, but it's a heads-up display about progress on an initiative. And we're doing something very similar to that on our point of sale system for this client, which gives the executives a decent understanding of how much is done and how much remains to be done, so they aren't so nervous and they can sleep at night. I think there is a place for visualizing that kind of stuff for people, even though it requires coming up with ways to do it as accurately as possible without saying like this is super 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 precise. It's never super precise.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say the type of approach that I've used on many product development efforts, greenfield, like what you're talking about, is centered around not only FDD type concepts, but really gets back to your requirements. You're working with the subject matter experts who know what they want for the POS, for example. You're building a domain model, the basic chunks. You're doing just enough work to get a feel for what is this thing that they want. And usually by the time you're done staring at each other in a room, that time spent getting a sense of the requirements, the domain model, and even a little sense of the priority, um, usually represented about 10% of the time that the project was going to take. So that tended to bear out. Now, it might go faster depending on the technology you use today, but it was something like that. It would be a technique I would use to try to do some sort of a estimate for such a thing that you're talking about.
All right, that was awesome, John. So we are almost, a little bit over our closing time. So I would like to thank everybody who joined the space. I would like to remind everybody that this is a recorded space, so you can come back and listen to it if you were not part of it from the start, or if you would like to share it with some of your colleagues or friends, you can also do that later on. Um, I'll give this one last chance to the panel if anyone wants to say closing remarks, and then we'll end the space. And just as a reminder, this is a recurring Twitter space that Industrial Logic is presenting. So we are live on Twitter every Friday at 2 p.m. Central. With that, I'll ask the panel if anyone wants to have any say anything, and then we'll close with that.
I just want to thank Josh and John for all of their input and remind people the Industrial Logic blog has a number of useful articles, including we've mentioned today.
Cool. I'm glad I stumbled on this accidentally. It's pretty cool. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
John, it was great listening to you. Yes, Josh, thank you so much for joining. And John, please keep joining us. Even though we do this every Friday. Kevin, Saurabh, thank you so much for joining the panel and asking your questions. We would actually like to, be more interactive and have more audience come on the speaker and, share their thoughts with us. But thank you so much, everybody, for today's session. It was a great one, and we'll see you with another topic, with another blog next Friday.
Quick call out to Anna, legacy archaeologist Felina. Thanks for joining.
All right, with that, I'm going to end the space. Happy weekend for everybody.